Greetings, time traveler, and welcome to tonight's gentle journey through history's forgotten corners. Whether you're unwinding after a demanding day or simply craving a moment of tranquility, I'm truly honored by your presence. Do share where you're tuning in from and what hour graces your location. Picture us as luminous specks dotting a spinning globe, bound together by curiosity and night's quiet embrace. Should these peaceful historical narratives bring serenity to your day, consider subscribing. Countless more tales from bygone eras await sharing. In this exploration, I'll transport you into the genuine daily rhythms of a medieval monarch, not the glamorized versions, but the meticulously reconstructed realities drawn from royal chronicles, court documents, and surviving administrative records. We'll examine these rulers' lives from dawn's first light until night's final candle, and I promise, this will revolutionize your perception of medieval royalty. But before we delve into the granular details, let me shatter some preconceptions with context that will leave you astonished. Most imagine medieval kingship as boundless authority and endless indulgence. The stark truth reveals rulers perpetually balancing on a knife's edge, where any misstep could terminate their reign before morning prayers. Their existence was an endless tightrope walk, appeasing rebellious nobles one moment, negotiating with church authorities the next, while simultaneously preparing for foreign invasions, mitigating economic disasters, and ensuring millions didn't starve, all while knowing assassination plots or coups could erupt without warning. What makes this even more compelling? After months poring over original household accounts, royal schedules, and administrative parchments, I've uncovered truths that will permanently alter your understanding of medieval power structures. These weren't ceremonial figureheads, but workaholic statesmen logging 16-hour days, making decisions carrying life or death consequences while governing empires spanning continents. The sheer cognitive multitasking and political acumen required was nothing short of extraordinary. So what precisely filled a medieval king's 24 hours? Their agendas were packed tighter than a modern Fortune 500 CEO's Outlook calendar. Let's begin at daybreak, where the reality proves far more fascinating than fiction. Envision this scene. First light creeping through narrow castle windows while the realm still slumbers. Yet the king is already being roused by attendants. But this was no simple wake-up call. A monarch's morning routine constituted a meticulously staged political theater establishing the day's tone. First came the dressing ritual performed by the royal valet, a process dripping with political symbolism. Each garment, accessory, and color selection broadcast calculated messages. Fabrics screamed wealth and authority. Hues conveyed subtle diplomatic signals. Even crown selection became strategic. Lighter circlets for informal gatherings, bejeweled crowns for state affairs. But here's where it gets intriguing. During this sartorial ceremony, the king was already conducting state business. Advisors swarmed around him, delivering overnight briefings, rebel movements in the north, urgent dispatches from the coast, petitions requiring immediate attention. Imagine deciding border policies while someone laces your boots. Just another Tuesday for medieval royalty. Next came morning devotions, non-negotiable spiritual obligations. In an era where monarchs ruled by divine mandate, skipping Mass wasn't an option. This wasn't merely personal piety, but the bedrock of their political legitimacy. Yet even during sacred rites, the king's mind remained politically engaged. The chapel pews teemed with observing nobles, foreign envoys, and clergy, all scrutinizing his every gesture for political tells. How long he knelt, whom he acknowledged afterward, even his seating position, everything was parsed for hidden meaning. Then arrived one of governance's most critical components, the morning audience, essentially walk-in hours for the kingdom's most powerful figure. Lords, bishops, merchants, and occasionally commoners queued to voice concerns directly. Here, the king's political instincts faced ultimate testing. Within hours, he might hear about Viking raids, merchant tax grievances, foreign marriage proposals, and noble disputes threatening civil war, then render judgments keeping all factions sufficiently content to prevent rebellion. But these sessions served dual purposes as intelligence goldmines. The king needed real-time updates about brewing troubles, enemy movements, and public sentiment across his territories. These face-to-face interactions became his early warning system against looming threats. Now consider this startling reality. Medieval kings were perpetual travelers. Not occasional progresses between palaces, but months-long itinerant courts covering thousands of miles annually. Why? Visibility equaled control in pre-industrial societies. Without mass communication, a stationary ruler risked distant regions forgetting royal authority existed. Local lords might start entertaining independence fantasies if the crown's presence faded. Thus kings embarked on exhausting circuits, 2 weeks in London, then northward for border disputes, south to inspect coastal defenses, west to check Welsh marches, all while dragging hundreds of courtiers, clerks, cooks, and soldiers along medieval roads that were essentially mud tracks. The logistical nightmare boggles modern minds. Entire governments relocated constantly, scribes drafting laws in bouncing wagons, treasurers counting coins in makeshift counting houses, royal beds disassembled and reassembled in drafty castles. Yet governance couldn't pause for travel. Legal documents required signatures, taxes needed supervision, and diplomatic correspondence demanded attention, all accomplished while jostling along on horseback or in bone-rattling carriages. This brings us to one of kingship's most surprising time consumers, paperwork. Yes, medieval monarchs drowned in administrative tasks that would overwhelm contemporary bureaucrats. Every land grant, tax levy, judicial appointment, and trade agreement required personal approval. But this wasn't mindless stamping. Kings needed deep comprehension of each document's implications. Grant lands to the wrong vassal, and you've armed a potential rebel. Set taxes too high, and peasant revolts ignite. Appoint incompetent generals, and armies perish. Thus kings became experts in law, economics, and military strategy, often consulting specialist advisors, but always bearing final responsibility. They needed encyclopedic knowledge of noble genealogies, territory values, trade route economics, and military strengths, both their allies and enemies. Now let's shatter another romanticized illusion. Medieval kings existed in perpetual mortal danger. This wasn't just occasional assassination attempts or foreign invasions, but an unrelenting awareness that dozens of conspirators actively plotted their demise daily. Medieval politics operated by brutal Darwinian rules. Monarchs displaying weakness got swiftly eliminated by ambitious rivals. Those alienating powerful nobles faced armed rebellions. Kings failing to defend borders confronted invading armies. Rulers losing popular support sometimes got dragged from castles and executed in public squares. This omnipresent threat of violence sculpted every royal habit. Kings traveled nowhere without armored escorts. Food tasters sampled every meal. Bedchambers were secured like fortresses. Even trusted advisors represented potential threats. Anyone with access could betray. Yet here's the fascinating paradox. Despite living like marked men, kings couldn't afford visible paranoia. Displaying fear signaled weakness, and weakness invited attacks. Thus, they perfected the art of projecting unshakable confidence while knowing daggers metaphorically and literally pointed at them from every direction. The psychological toll of this performance was crushing. Every public appearance demanded flawless acting, radiating power and control even when privately terrified of assassins in the crowd. Historical records reveal the stress consequences. Many kings died young from what modern medicine would diagnose as stress-induced illnesses. Others developed anxiety disorders or paranoid tendencies. Some turned to alcohol. Several eventually cracked under pressure, making erratic decisions accelerating their downfall. Yet the survivors mastered an impossible balancing act, remaining sufficiently vigilant to stay alive while projecting enough confidence to govern effectively. Speaking of governance, let's demolish another Hollywood myth. Medieval kings weren't just battlefield figureheads who appeared for dramatic charges. They operated complex military-industrial systems requiring year-round management. Consider the logistical nightmares: maintaining standing armies, fortifying hundreds of castles, coordinating supply lines across primitive infrastructure, negotiating with mercenary companies, and planning campaigns lasting years. Medieval warfare defied modern organizational logic. Armies weren't professional forces, but chaotic coalitions of knights who owed service but pursued personal agendas, mercenaries loyal only to highest bidders, and peasant levies, untrained farmers desperate to return home. Managing these factions demanded diplomatic genius. Knights needed glory opportunities, mercenaries required prompt payment, peasants needed motivation without exploitation, all while actually winning battles against enemies equally determined to survive. The supply chain challenges alone could break modern logisticians. Feeding thousands of soldiers without refrigeration or transport networks meant organizing wagon trains crawling at walking speed across roadless landscapes. But securing provisions was just half the battle. Kings also had to deny resources to enemies by controlling bridges, mills, and granaries. This required maintaining sophisticated intelligence networks tracking enemy movements and intentions. Now imagine making tactical decisions amidst battlefield chaos, arrows flying, men screaming, visibility obscured by dust and armor. With no radios or communication systems, kings lost contact with entire army divisions once fighting commenced. Split-second choices determined whether armies lived or died. Pardon medieval commanders who aged prematurely. One poor decision didn't just mean losing battles. It risked complete kingdom collapse, dynastic eradication, and family extermination by victorious foes. This created evolutionary pressure for constant military innovation. Kings studied emerging weapons technologies, analyzed fortification designs, and cultivated relationships with brilliant tacticians. Their libraries contained not just poetry, but treatises on siege warfare and cavalry maneuvers. Regular weapons training maintained combat readiness. A king who couldn't lead from the front lost warriors' respect. Yet military leadership was just one facet of royal responsibilities. Prepare for another surprise. Medieval kings functioned as CEO-level economic managers. Governing a kingdom resembled running a sprawling multinational corporation with countless revenue streams and employees. Royal estates produced agricultural goods. Mines extracted precious metals. Customs posts collected trade tariffs. Royal workshops manufactured everything from swords to tapestries. But beyond profit generation, kings engaged in strategic economic planning. Which industries deserved investment to strengthen the realm? Which trade partnerships offered mutual benefits? How to stimulate growth without losing political control? Their decisions mirror modern boardroom dilemmas. Raise taxes for military funding, risking economic slowdown. Devalue currency to boost exports, sparking inflation, or grant foreign merchants privileges, undercutting domestic businesses. Economic crises loomed constantly. Crop failures triggering famines, trade wars disrupting commerce, rival kingdoms manipulating currencies. Kings' financial decisions impacted millions. Missteps could ignite rebellions or collapse entire sectors. Astonishingly, they managed this without modern tools, no statistical models, forecasting algorithms, or even double-entry bookkeeping. Decisions relied on personal judgment, advisor consultations, and merchant gossip, a high-stakes version of running a Fortune 500 company using only abacuses and parchment. Now let's pull back the curtain on one of the crown's heaviest responsibilities, judicial authority. Medieval kings weren't just political and military leaders. They served as the Supreme Court for their entire realm. The most complex, politically charged cases inevitably landed before them. Noble disputes threatening civil wars, treason accusations against high-ranking officials, property conflicts involving vast territories, criminal cases carrying death penalties. Each ruling sent ripples through the kingdom's fragile power structures. Imagine presiding over cases where your judgment determined whether ancient families kept ancestral lands, whether accused traitors lived or died, whether simmering conflicts erupted into open warfare. These weren't abstract legal exercises, but decisions carrying immediate, bloody consequences. Medieval law itself was a labyrinth. Royal statutes coexisted with church canon law, feudal customs, and regional traditions, often contradicting each other. When ecclesiastical law clashed with royal decrees, or local traditions conflicted with centralized authority, kings had to navigate these treacherous waters without capsizing their legitimacy. But judicial duties extended beyond high-profile cases. Kings oversaw entire court systems, appointing judges, standardizing procedures, ensuring verdict enforcement, and handling appeals. Medieval justice could be harsh, think public executions and mutilations, but required sufficient fairness to maintain social order. Strike too softly, and criminals grew emboldened; too harshly, and you risked being seen as a tyrant. This balancing act required deep understanding of human nature and local customs across diverse territories. Now let's examine medieval kingship's ultimate tightrope walk: diplomacy. Governing was like playing 4D chess while blindfolded, with your kingdom's survival at stake. Kings maintained intricate relationships with foreign rulers, allies today, enemies tomorrow, church hierarchies, claiming authority over spiritual matters, powerful nobles, controlling private armies, and merchant guilds, holding economic lifelines. Every conversation, letter, or meeting was a high-stakes negotiation where a single misspoken word could trigger disasters. Diplomatic success required masterful people-reading skills to detect hidden agendas. Why was the French ambassador suddenly praising your wine? Was the Pope's letter subtly threatening excommunication? When your strongest vassal requested private counsel, was he offering loyalty or plotting betrayal? Beyond interpersonal skills, kings needed encyclopedic knowledge of shifting alliances, who secretly hated whom, which families had generations-old feuds, how marriage ties connected rival factions. Maintaining this mental web of relationships required extensive spy networks and hours analyzing political intelligence. Here's where medieval kings displayed true genius. They transformed routine activities into multifaceted opportunities. A royal hunt wasn't just sport, but combined military training, cavalry maneuvers, diplomacy, private noble discussions, intelligence gathering, local condition reports, and public relations, commoners seeing their king's prowess. Similarly, banquets blended entertainment with alliance building, information exchange, and power displays. This multitasking extended to communications. A single royal missive might simultaneously convey military orders, economic policies, legal judgments, and diplomatic positions through carefully layered language. Now consider crisis management medieval style. When enemy armies invaded, kings couldn't pause other governance aspects to focus solely on defense. They had to simultaneously secure noble loyalties before departing, taking hostages from untrustworthy lords, arrange interim governance, negotiate emergency war taxes without triggering revolts, recruit allies through diplomacy, maintain routine legal proceedings, and ensure tax collection continued funding the war effort, all while preparing to lead troops into battle. The coordination required was staggering, accomplished without phones or email. Every order went by horseback messengers who might take weeks to deliver, assuming they weren't intercepted. Kings developed redundancy systems, sending duplicate messages via different routes, using ciphers for sensitive information. They had to anticipate scenarios months ahead, since reacting to events in real time was impossible. A request for allied reinforcements required predicting battlefield conditions weeks later when help might arrive. This brings us to medieval kingship's most psychologically brutal aspect: the crushing weight of decisions determining life or death for thousands. Modern leaders face criticism for policy mistakes. Medieval kings saw cities burned and populations slaughtered from poor choices. Imagine choosing which 3 border towns to defend against invaders knowing you could only protect 2, condemning the third to rape, pillage, and slaughter. These weren't statistical casualties, but people whose faces you remembered from progress visits, whose children you'd blessed at festivals. The torment extended beyond military choices. Economic policies meant life and death trade-offs. Raising taxes to fortify castles might save future generations, but starve current subjects. Appointing the wrong regional governor could unleash corruption, sparking rebellions years later. Even small, administrative decisions could trigger chain reactions, killing thousands. Kings bore this moral burden while maintaining composure. Showing doubt risked emboldening enemies or panicking populations. Many developed what we now recognize as PTSD symptoms, chronic anxiety, depression, or substance abuse from cumulative trauma. Records describe rulers growing increasingly paranoid or erratic after years of impossible choices. The survivors learned to compartmentalize grief while projecting strength, finding solace in believing their sacrifices preserved greater order. They memorialized the dead through chapels and charities while hardening themselves to make similar decisions tomorrow. Let's shatter another myth. Medieval kings weren't solitary rulers barking orders from ivory towers. They operated within elaborately structured advisory systems that would impress modern management consultants. Forget the image of capricious autocrats. Successful monarchs built sophisticated councils blending diverse expertise to tackle governance's multidimensional challenges. Picture this: war councils with grizzled marshals analyzing threat matrices, treasury boards where merchant-born ministers crunched numbers on parchment spreadsheets, ecclesiastical committees parsing canon law implications, all feeding structured advice to the throne. These weren't casual brainstorming sessions, but highly formalized institutions. The military council comprised combat-tested commanders providing frontline insights. The chancery housed legal scholars ensuring royal decrees aligned with established jurisprudence. Ecclesiastical advisors navigated the faith-power tightrope. Economic specialists monitored trade flows and tax yields. Each member underwent rigorous selection, not just for technical competence, but unwavering loyalty, as disgruntled advisors could become tomorrow's rebel leaders. The real magic lay in how kings leveraged these systems. They created environments where experts debated vigorously yet maintained deference to royal authority, a balance modern corporations still struggle to achieve. Imagine chairing a war council where seasoned generals contradicted your siege strategy, then synthesizing their input into decisive orders without appearing weak. Or mediating between church prelates demanding crusades and treasury officials warning of bankruptcy. Successful kings became masters of structured dissent, encouraging candid counsel while preventing endless debate from paralyzing decision-making. Now consider the cognitive marathon of royal information management. Without databases or filing systems, kings relied on trained memories to track thousands of data points. The military strength of every vassal and their grudges, terms of decades-old treaties, crop yields across provinces, architectural vulnerabilities of border castles. They maintained mental maps of noble genealogies, knowing that Baron A's daughter marrying Duke B's heir could shift regional power balances. Chancery clerks might record documents, but kings needed instant recall during negotiations, like human search engines with life or death stakes. This mental load extended to situational awareness. During harvest crises, they had to calculate. If we reduce eastern provinces' grain taxes by 20% to prevent famine, can western mines' silver output cover the revenue loss? When the Pope demanded crusader levies, they balanced religious expectations against knowing the same knights were suppressing rebellions at home. The best developed what modern strategists call ODA loops, observing threats, orienting to contexts, deciding rapidly, and acting decisively, then repeating the cycle as situations evolved. Language mastery formed another critical skill set. Fluent Latin for church negotiations, French for diplomacy, regional dialects for connecting with subjects. Multilingualism was non-negotiable. Royal libraries contained not just illuminated psalters, but technical manuals on siege engineering, Arabic mathematics treatises, and translated Greek philosophy. When Venetian ambassadors spoke in merchant argot or Welsh chieftains used poetic metaphors, kings had to parse meaning while projecting erudition. The physical toll of this lifestyle would break modern executives. Dawn to midnight workdays were standard. morning petitions hearing commoners' complaints, afternoon inspections of garrison readiness, evening strategy sessions, late-night correspondence review, all while traveling weeks annually on horseback along roads that were essentially mud trenches. Surviving itineraries show kings covering 1,500 miles yearly in all weather, feasting in York one week, holding court in Canterbury the next, then rushing to repel Scottish border raids. Medical hardships compounded the strain. Chronic pain from old battle wounds, armor clashes left lifelong injuries, recurring malaria from swampy castle locations, digestive ailments from preserved foods. Kings worked through conditions that would hospitalize modern leaders. Records describe monarchs conducting state business while feverish or directing battles with arrow wounds festering under armor. The infamous royal touch for healing scrofula perhaps originated from subjects seeing kings persevere through visible suffering. Yet amidst these pressures, successful rulers cultivated remarkable stress resilience. They compartmentalized personal grief when making wartime sacrifices, found solace in prayer or astronomy between crises, developed dark humor about assassination attempts. Some kept journals analyzing their decisions' outcomes, medieval versions of executive coaching. The wisest recognized their limitations, like Henry II consulting Eleanor of Aquitaine on southern provinces' cultural nuances despite their marital strife. Financial management alone could overwhelm modern treasurers. Kings juggled castle maintenance costs. A single fortress's annual upkeep equaled 300 peasants' lifetime earnings. Mercenary payrolls, often paid in loot rights rather than coin. Fluctuating tax revenues, highly dependent on harvests, and dowry payments for strategic marriages. When coin shortages hit, they pioneered creative solutions, like Edward I will export taxes or Philip IV Templar asset seizure. Their account books reveal sophisticated asset diversification, land holdings, trade investments, even early forms of war bonds. The ceremonial demands added another layer of complexity. Coronations, knightings, royal weddings. Each required months of preparation with precise protocol adherence. A misstep like wearing the wrong crown at a German summit could spark diplomatic incidents. Kings maintained ceremony masters, tracking intricate details. Which bishop held the scepter during which hymn, how many steps to descend before pausing for applause. These rituals weren't vanity projects, but vital legitimacy theater. The medieval equivalent of modern PR campaigns reinforcing brand authority. Let's dismantle another persistent fallacy, that medieval kings ruled through brute force alone. In reality, their power resembled a complex ecosystem where influence flowed through carefully cultivated relationships rather than raw coercion. Picture a vast neural network where each noble, bishop, and merchant represented a node requiring individualized management strategies. The king's true genius lay in maintaining this ever-shifting web of alliances through what we now call emotional intelligence and strategic networking. Consider the intricate dance of noble management. Each powerful lord controlled private armies and castles, yet relied on royal favor for legitimacy. The king had to balance rewarding loyalty without creating overmighty subjects. Granting Baron a lucrative tax collection rights might secure his allegiance, but provoke jealousy from Earl B. Some required lands to cement loyalty, others thirsted for military commands to win glory. The most dangerous were those nursing generational grievances, like the Percy family's smoldering resentment after Henry IV broke promises to them. Successful kings developed psychological profiles for each major vassal, remembering that Duke X would revolt if publicly humiliated, while Count Y responded best to private admonishments. Marriage alliances became geopolitical chess, played across generations. When arranging Prince Edward's betrothal to Spanish Princess Isabella, Edward I wasn't just securing a bride, but gaining access to Iberian naval power against France. These negotiations required understanding obscure inheritance laws, like how Eleanor of Aquitaine's divorce from Louis VII automatically transferred her vast duchy to Henry II, reshaping European power maps. Kings kept mental dossiers on every noble daughter's lineage and dowry, calculating how each union could strengthen crown authority decades later. The royal court itself was a pressure cooker of competing ambitions. Ambitious young knights sought promotions, clerics angled for bishoprics, poets vied for patronage, all while spying on rivals for advantage. Kings mastered the art of controlled access, making certain petitioners wait weeks for audiences to amplify gratitude for eventual royal attention. They staged elaborate rituals where granting a minor lord the honor of carving the royal meat at banquet could secure his family's loyalty for generations. Financial leverage operated with Renaissance-era sophistication. Instead of outright confiscating rebellious nobles' lands, which bred resentment, smart kings imposed crushing fines payable through annual installments, keeping the offenders perpetually indebted to the throne. Richard II pioneered using customs revenues as collateral for loans from Italian bankers, essentially creating medieval sovereign bonds. When short on coin, kings accepted in-kind payments, accepting Welsh archers' military service instead of taxes from poor mountain regions. Religious authority presented another delicate balancing act. While kings claimed divine right to rule, they clashed constantly with popes over authority limits. The investiture controversy saw emperors and pontiffs excommunicating each other over who could appoint bishops. Smart monarchs like Louis IX of France mastered devout pragmatism, funding magnificent cathedrals to demonstrate piety while quietly limiting church judicial powers through royal courts. They cultivated saintly reputations through pilgrimages and relic veneration, yet arrested bishops who overstepped political bounds. Urban centers required completely different governance approaches. Unlike land-bound nobles, wealthy burghers in cities like Ghent or Florence cared more about trade privileges than feudal honors. Kings granted coveted manufacturing monopolies to gain merchant support. Edward III famously gave Flemish weavers exclusive rights to English wool exports. But they also knew when to crack down. When Lübeck's merchants grew too powerful, the Danish king suspended their Hanseatic League privileges until they financed his wars. The military-industrial complex demanded hands-on management. Maintaining royal armories supplying thousands of arrows daily required establishing standardized production across dozens of workshops. Henry V personally tested new longbow designs before mass commissioning. Kings kept private corps of military engineers who developed siege engines and castle improvements, the medieval equivalent of defense R&D departments. When gunpowder emerged, forward-thinking monarchs like Charles VIII of France immediately created dedicated artillery branches. Intelligence networks formed the kingdom's nervous system. Royal spies embedded in foreign courts sent encrypted reports using ciphers that predated the Voynich manuscript. Some posed as merchants tracking grain shipments to predict enemy movements. Others infiltrated noble households as servants reporting dinner-table conversations. Richard the Lionheart's network extended into the Sultan's court during the Crusades, where his agents learned Arabic to intercept battlefield plans. Education systems prepared future administrators. Beyond training heirs, kings established schools like Charlemagne's Palace Academy to groom talented commoners for civil service. These bureaucrats in training learned accounting with Roman numerals, legal drafting in Latin, and the art of composing diplomatically worded letters that could placate angry vassals. The most promising might rise to chancellor, like Thomas Becket, the merchant's son who became Henry II's right hand before their famous falling out. Ceremonial magic reinforced secular power. Coronation rituals blended pagan symbolism with Christian liturgy to create awe-inspiring spectacles. The English coronation oil allegedly traced to the Virgin Mary herself, while French kings claimed healing powers through St. Louis' sanctified touch. When facing challenges, rulers staged elaborate displays like Frederick II parading through Jerusalem, wearing imperial regalia during the Sixth Crusade, political theater demonstrating divine favor to doubters. The psychological warfare medieval kings endured would break modern leaders within weeks. Imagine maintaining regal composure while knowing every smiling courtier might be an assassin. Each banquet could conceal poison, and even your closest blood relatives plotted your overthrow. This wasn't paranoia, but documented reality. Of England's 14 monarchs between 1066 to 1485, 5 died violently at subjects' hands. Kings developed survival strategies worthy of CIA operatives. Edward II installed latrine gratings after learning of plots to stab him during private moments. Richard II employed food tasters decades before the Borgias made it infamous. Sleep itself became a vulnerability. Royal bedchambers were fortresses within fortresses, with trusted guards sworn to sleep across the doorway. Henry V took this further, varying his sleeping locations randomly like a medieval version of a witness protection relotatee. The famous groom of the stool, responsible for the king's toilet needs, wasn't just a servant, but a last-line bodyguard during defenseless moments. Kings even weaponized their vulnerability, deliberately appearing unarmed among crowds to demonstrate divine protection, like Saint Olaf of Norway holding court without guards while war horns sounded nearby. The cognitive dissonance required was staggering. Kings had to project absolute confidence while privately assessing every interaction for threats. When Duke of Lancaster John of Gaunt entered Westminster with 200 retainers, Richard II had to instantly calculate whether this was routine noble pomp or a coup in progress. They mastered the poker face centuries before cards existed. Sigurd the Crusader continued feasting upon receiving his own death warrant, casually folding the parchment into a napkin holder while planning countermeasures. Family posed the cruelest traps. Royal sons were both heirs and existential threats. Henry II's offspring rebelled repeatedly, egged on by their mother Eleanor. Brothers could be worse. King John murdered nephew Arthur to secure his throne, while Byzantine emperors routinely blinded siblings to disqualify them from rule. Kings developed brutal emotional calluses, like Basil II, who blinded 15,000 Bulgar prisoners, yet reportedly wept privately over his sister's betrayal. The smartest created power-sharing fictions, Ferdinand and Isabella jointly ruling Spain while quietly maintaining separate spheres of influence. Religious authority cut both ways. While kings derived power from divine right, the church could excommunicate them, a spiritual nuclear option making subjects consider rebellion justified. Henry IV stood barefoot in alpine snow for 3 days before Pope Gregory VII lifted his excommunication, a humiliation that still didn't prevent his eventual deposition. Savvy monarchs played the long game. Edward I waited years to arrest corrupt judges until he could prove they'd also committed heresy, thus neutralizing church objections. Economic warfare required similar finesse. When Philip IV needed to destroy the Knights Templar, he didn't just seize their wealth, but first engineered a propaganda campaign, painting them as heretics, medieval equivalent of modern sanctions justification. Currency manipulation was rampant. Kings would recall coins, remint them with less silver, and pocket the difference. The smartest, like Henry VII, maintained dual exchange rates, strong currency for foreign trade, debased coins for domestic use where protest risk was lower. Information control operated with frightening modernity. Royal proclamations were carefully worded psychological operations. When announcing victories, kings emphasized divine favor. For defeats, they blamed treacherous subordinates or unforeseeable circumstances. Richard III's infamous bloody dagger display after the prince's and the Tower disappearance was pure crisis PR, attempting to preempt rumors through shocking transparency. They employed what we'd now call flooding the zone tactics. Edward IV commissioned hundreds of copies of his claim to the throne for distribution nationwide when facing challengers. The physicality of medieval rule shocks modern sensibilities. Kings spent hours daily in full armor during campaigns. The 14th century Black Prince armor in London Tower weighs 96 pounds, equivalent to wearing a teenage boy while commanding battles. Royal progresses meant weeks in the saddle. Elizabeth I's summer progresses covered 800 miles on horseback, often in pouring rain. Even sedentary activities like holding court required endurance. Byzantine Emperor Justinian reportedly heard legal cases for 36 hours straight during crises, fueled by honeyed wine and sheer willpower. Medical knowledge limitations compounded suffering. When Crusader King Baldwin IV's leprosy progressed, he continued ruling with disintegrating hands wrapped in ceremonial gloves. Kings underwent horrific medieval treatments. Charles VI of France was cured of madness by having red-hot pokers inserted into his skull passages. Yet they persevered. Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II conducted zoological experiments while suffering from dysentery that killed half his crusading army. The administrative burden defies belief. Richard the Lionheart issued over 2,000 charters during his decade-long reign, one every 2 days, while also fighting wars. The famous Doomsday Book census required processing data from 13,000 settlements without computers. Kings developed early bureaucratic systems. Byzantine emperors used a 40-part document classification system, while Alfonso X of Castile created standardized legal codes reducing regional variations. Ceremonial demands were equally grueling. Coronation rituals could last 12 hours. The English ceremony included 87 distinct liturgical stages. Royal weddings were multi-day marathons. When James IV of Scotland married Margaret Tudor, the celebrations lasted 2 weeks with the king required to attend every joust, banquet, and masque. Even funerals were endurance tests. Philip II of Spain's obsequies involved a 3-mile procession with the king walking behind the coffin in 95 degrees Fahrenheit heat, wearing black velvet robes. The education of medieval princes would put modern Ivy League programs to shame. A brutal, decades-long boot camp where failure meant death and excellence merely postponed it. From the moment a royal heir could walk, his training regimen blended Spartan physical conditioning with Renaissance intellectual rigor. Picture a 6-year-old future king practicing Latin declensions at dawn, then spending afternoons mastering swordplay under grizzled knights who deliberately left bruises to teach combat realities. By 12, he'd be analyzing Byzantine military treatises. At 15, presiding over mock judicial cases where wrong verdicts earned his tutors scathing critiques. This was education as survival imperative. Young princes learned genealogical webs not as academic exercise, but because confusing the Count of Anjou with his hated Burgundian cousin could spark diplomatic disasters. They memorized tax yields from every province, not to pass exams, but to detect when stewards skimmed revenues. Language training was life or death. Henry V fluent French won the Battle of Agincourt when he overheard enemy officers' whispered plans. The most gifted, like Alfonso X of Castile, became true polymaths. His astronomical tables remained naval navigation standards for centuries. Physical training bordered on torture. Future kings endured mock battles wearing full armor in summer heat, their blistered skin salted by sweat as veteran warriors tested their endurance. Horsemanship drills involved controlling war horses while blindfolded, a necessary skill for fighting in dust-choked battlefields. Archery practice continued until fingers bled, because a king who couldn't outshoot his own longbowmen lost their respect. The infamous Knight's Bath, where squires scrubbed their masters with sand to toughen skin, was just Tuesday for royal heirs. But book learning proved equally grueling. Theology lessons weren't Sunday school affairs, but intense debates about how to leverage divine authority without triggering papal interference. Mathematics focused on siege engine trajectories and tax revenue projections rather than abstract theory. When studying Aristotle's Politics, princes had to apply each principle to their kingdom's specific vulnerabilities, explaining how Athenian democracy's failures justified their absolute rule. The psychological conditioning was arguably most brutal. Heirs underwent simulated crises where advisors fed them contradictory information while sleep-deprived, forcing snap decisions with real consequences. A young Edward III once had to choose between rescuing besieged allies or protecting his supply lines. His wrong choice resulted in tutors letting real soldiers go hungry for days to teach the lesson. Some kings in training kept error books, documenting their mistakes, like medieval performance review binders. Apprenticeship through governance started shockingly early. 12-year-old future kings might be given nominal control over border garrisons, with veteran castellans whispering advice during actual military decisions. 14-year-olds presided over regional courts, their verdicts silently corrected afterward by royal judges if flawed. This learn-by-doing approach extended to diplomacy. Teenage princes were sent to foreign courts as honored guests, actually serving as royal spies assessing enemy strengths. The hazing rituals would violate modern child labor laws. During his initiation into knighthood, young Henry V was forced to stand vigil for 48 hours straight in full armor before the ceremony even began. Future Byzantine emperors underwent a bizarre rite where senators, accidentally, dropped the imperial crown during coronation rehearsals. If the heir flinched, he was deemed unworthy. Scandinavian princes faced blood eagle threats, not actual executions, but enough psychological terror to weed out the weak-willed. Women's political education was equally intense, though less visible. Heiresses like Eleanor of Aquitaine studied complex inheritance laws until they could recite precedents backward. Royal daughters practiced intercepting coded messages between courtiers, a skill Isabella of France used to expose her husband Edward II's corrupt favorites. Some, like Matilda of Tuscany, received full military training. Her ability to read battlefield maps later helped secure the papal throne during the investiture controversy. The final exam was literal trial by fire. When young Louis IX faced rebellion during his minority, the 12-year-old had to don armor and parade through Paris streets despite assassination risks. His composure during this crisis cemented loyalist support. Similarly, 15-year-old Charles VII's first act upon inheriting a collapsing France was to negotiate with murderous Burgundian factions, a baptism by fire that forged his eventual reconquest of Normandy. This merciless preparation produced rulers of astonishing capability. By coronation day, a medieval king had typically survived assassination attempts, led troops in battle, settled complex legal disputes, and negotiated international treaties, all before most modern CEOs get their first management position. The system's cruelty was its strength. When Henry V at 26 crushed France's finest knights at Agincourt, he was simply applying lessons learned during countless simulated crises. The coronation ceremony of a medieval king was no mere symbolic ritual. It was a meticulously choreographed psychological operation designed to rewrite reality itself. Picture Westminster Abbey at dawn on coronation day, the scent of beeswax candles mixing with frankincense as armored knights form a living corridor, their sword points creating a shimmering steel canopy above the royal procession. Every element, from the holy oil's mythical origins, allegedly delivered by the Virgin Mary to St. Thomas Becket, to the exact angle at which the crown touched the sovereign's brow, was engineered to imprint divine legitimacy onto observers' subconscious. This theatrical magic extended far beyond the cathedral. 4 weeks preceding the event, royal heralds crisscrossed the kingdom performing enhanced announcement protocols, essentially medieval PR campaigns that blended news dissemination with mythological storytelling. They proclaimed the new king's lineage tracing back to legendary figures like King Arthur or even biblical monarchs, while discreetly distributing commemorative coins depicting the ruler alongside saints. The coronation oath itself was a masterclass in strategic ambiguity, vague enough to allow future policy flexibility, to uphold justice, yet specific in key areas, to protect Holy Church, to secure clerical support. The wardrobe department would put Hollywood to shame. Royal tailors spent months crafting the coronation robe, a 30-pound masterpiece woven with golden thread so dense it shimmered like liquid sunlight when the king moved. The crown jewels weren't just displayed but activated as psychological weapons. The orb symbolizing global dominion held precisely at heart level during the oath, the scepter's jeweled tip catching sunlight at predetermined moments to create divine spark effects. Even the king's undergarments carried symbolism. specially blessed linen shirts that allegedly made wearers invulnerable to poison. The sacred anointing ritual operated on multiple psychological levels. As the archbishop traced holy oil on the king's forehead, wrists, and breastbone, forming a symbolic cross, observers underwent what modern neuroscientists would call neural entrainment, their brainwaves synchronizing with the ritual's rhythmic prayers. The oil's recipe was a state secret, with ingredients like ambergris and crushed gemstones adding olfactory and visual stimuli to heighten the mystical experience. When the heavy crown finally descended, its weight, English crowns averaged 5 pounds, created literal pressure reinforcing the burden of office, a visceral sensation the king would recall during future crises. Post-ceremony festivities were equally calculated. The coronation banquet featured prestige food items, like roasted swans with gilded feathers, not for taste, but to demonstrate wealth destruction as power display. When the king ceremonially washed his hands between courses, the silver ewer used was deliberately oversized to require 2 servants to lift, subtly reinforcing royal superiority. Even the seating chart was psychological warfare. Rebellious nobles placed near the king to showcase reconciliation, while loyalists strategically positioned to block assassination attempts. The coronation's impact extended months beyond the event itself. Traveling artists circulated woodcut prints depicting the ceremony to remote villages, medieval equivalents of viral media campaigns. Minstrels composed catchy ballads blending the king's ancestry with heroic deeds, real or imagined, designed to lodge in peasant memories. In border regions, royal agents staged mini-coronations, where local officials swore oaths on relics transported from the capital, creating psychological bonds between periphery and center. Religious institutions amplified the messaging. Parish priests received specially prepared sermon kits explaining the coronation's theological significance, essentially talking points for mass indoctrination. Monasteries were encouraged to record the event in their chronicles with standardized favorable language, creating the medieval version of search engine optimization for historical memory. When the Bishop of London declared during Richard II's coronation that the king's touch now cures scrofula, it wasn't spontaneous, but a carefully planned launch of royal propaganda. The military component was equally calculated. New kings traditionally pardoned prisoners, earning popular goodwill, while simultaneously announcing harsh penalties for future crimes, a classic carrot-and-stick approach. Garrison commanders received orders to stage celebratory weapon demonstrations during the coronation week, subtly reminding potential rebels of royal might. Naval squadrons conducted synchronized harbor cannonades from major ports, the sound waves carrying political messages far inland. Financial markets were manipulated to cement the transition. Royal treasurers timed debt repayments to key merchants during coronation month, creating liquidity that stimulated economic activity, a medieval version of quantitative easing. Simultaneously, the mint issued new coinage with slightly altered silver content, a stealthy way to raise funds while commoners were distracted by celebrations. Smart kings like Edward III used these occasions to renegotiate loans under the guise of new reign generosity. The psychological impact on the king himself was profound. After enduring the grueling ceremony, 12+ hours without bathroom breaks, experiencing the weight of the crown and the intoxicating roar of crowds, many rulers reported transcendent clarity, what we'd now call a flow state. This became their internal benchmark for legitimate authority, referenced during future challenges. When Henry V faced mutinous troops years after his coronation, he reportedly touched his crown and instantly regained command presence, the ritual's conditioning enduring long after the event. The true measure of a medieval king's greatness wasn't found in battlefield victories or conquered territories, but in the administrative systems they left humming smoothly behind them, clockwork mechanisms of governance that could endure their absence. Consider Charlemagne's revolutionary Missi Dominici, royal envoys, pairs of inspectors, one secular lord, one bishop, who crisscrossed the empire on predetermined circuits like living audit algorithms. Their meticulously standardized questionnaires assessed everything from grain silo levels to judicial fairness, with comparative data revealing regional administrators' performance gaps. This wasn't governance by charisma, but by reproducible systems, a concept startlingly modern for the 8th century. Financial controls reached levels that would make contemporary accountants blink. The Anglo-Saxon Hyde system wasn't just land measurement, but a sophisticated taxation algorithm. Each hide, approximately 120 acres, representing 1 unit of productive capacity, adjusted annually for soil depletion or improvements. Royal treasurers developed double-entry techniques centuries before Luca Pacioli's famous treatise, with the English exchequer's tally sticks using notches of varying depths to denote sums from pennies to thousands of pounds. When Richard I needed to raise his colossal 100,000 mark ransom, his administrators implemented progressive taxation, charging nobles 25% of annual income, while monasteries paid flat rates based on relic collections' estimated market value. Legal innovations reveal even greater sophistication. Alfonso X of Castile's Siete Partidas codified laws into 7 thematic volumes with cross-referencing systems, while English kings developed writ factories that mass-produced standardized legal documents like modern form letters. The most impressive were self-correcting mechanisms. Henry II Assize of Clarendon established grand juries requiring local communities to police themselves, effectively crowdsourcing law enforcement centuries before community policing theories emerged. Even seemingly minor procedural tweaks had outsized impacts. When Edward I mandated that all property disputes required written deeds rather than oral testimony, he accidentally triggered a literacy surge as landowners rushed to educate their heirs. Infrastructure investments followed similarly systematic approaches. Frederick II's construction of Castel del Monte wasn't just architectural vanity. Its octagonal design served as a geodetic reference point for surveyors recalibrating land measurements across Sicily. The Venetian-inspired staple system, established by English kings, created distributed warehousing networks where wool exports were quality-checked, standardized, and pre-positioned for continental buyers. Royal forests weren't mere hunting preserves, but carefully managed timber reserves, with vert and venison laws regulating everything from tree-felling rotations to deer population controls, medieval environmental management at its finest. Military logistics displayed frightening modernity. The English Crown's array system functioned like a proto-draft database, with county commissioners maintaining updated rolls of all able-bodied men and their weapons, a 14th-century version of selective service records. Armor production was outsourced through quality-controlled franchising. Royal armories provided standardized patterns to licensed smiths, with each piece bearing both the craftsman's mark and royal insignia for accountability. When preparing for campaigns, kings employed staple ports, where supply ships underwent load optimization, a medieval equivalent of containerized shipping protocols. Education systems became talent pipelines. Beyond palace schools for nobles, kings established chantry scholarships, funding bright commoners' education in exchange for future civil service, a student loan system avant la lettre. The most advanced was Alfonso X's Toledo School of Translators, which didn't just render Arabic texts into Latin, but developed standardized technical vocabularies for astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. Royal secretariats operated meritocratic promotion tracks where scribes could rise from copying charters to drafting treaties based on demonstrated competence, a radical concept in an aristocratic age. Public health measures show surprising foresight. When the Black Death hit, intelligent kings like Casimir III of Poland implemented quarantine zones and movement restrictions that reduced mortality rates dramatically. English kings maintained royal physicians who doubled as epidemiological investigators, tracking disease outbreaks and recommending sanitation improvements. Frederick II's medical reforms included licensing exams for doctors and mandatory postmortems for suspicious deaths, creating forensic standards that wouldn't become common elsewhere for centuries. The true testament to these systems' robustness? How many survived their creators? William the Conqueror's doomsday survey apparatus continued generating actionable data for successors long after his death. The Capetian dynasty's bureaucratic frameworks powered French governance for 300 years beyond its founders. These weren't personal fiefdoms, but institutional legacies, the medieval equivalents of operating systems that kept running through power transitions and crises. When modern historians marvel at how small medieval administrations governed vast territories effectively, they're recognizing these kings' unsung genius as system designers rather than just warriors or lawmakers. The twilight years of medieval kings reveal a profound paradox. Their greatest challenges emerged not from external enemies, but from the very systems they created to perpetuate their legacy. Take Henry II's bitter irony. After establishing England's most sophisticated legal bureaucracy, he found himself imprisoned by its mechanisms when the system turned against his own family. His rebellious son Richard used royal courts to confiscate his father's lands, while another son John weaponized tax records to bankrupt loyalists. The administrative state, designed as a crown jewel, became a guillotine hovering over aging monarchs. Succession planning was less chess match and more high-stakes exorcism of generational demons. Edward III spent his final years creating a governance firewall, dividing his vast holdings among multiple heirs to prevent any single successor from becoming too powerful, only to watch his carefully balanced system collapse into the War of the Roses. The smartest kings turned to institutional solutions. Frederick Barbarossa established inheritance tribunals staffed by neutral Italian jurists, while Alfonso VI of Leon invented the living will concept, having his proposed succession ratified by Parliament years before his death. The physical toll of decades of kingship manifested in grotesque medical dramas. Philip II of Spain's gout-ridden corpse was so swollen it couldn't fit into the prepared coffin, requiring emergency carpentry during the funeral mass. Louis VI's obesity reached such extremes that special reinforced chairs had to be built for court sessions, yet he continued reviewing troop deployments from his bed while maggots infested his necrotic legs. These weren't just personal tragedies, but constitutional crises. When a king's body failed before his systems did, the resulting power vacuums could undo lifetimes of institution building. Financial legacy management became its own dark art. Edward I left his son debts totaling £200,000, roughly the kingdom's entire annual GDP, forcing Edward II to invent creative repayment schemes like accepting will bails as tax payments. More cunning monarchs like Ferdinand of Aragon established deniability funds, secret treasury reserves accessible only through complex cryptographic protocols, allowing successors to pay off critics while maintaining plausible distance from unpopular compromises. Knowledge transfer between generations resembled corporate CEO transitions gone medieval. Experienced kings created shadow governments of young advisors who trained under veteran ministers, the 14th century equivalent of management consultants conducting succession workshops. Henry the Navigator took this further, establishing a literal school for kings at Sagres where Portuguese princes studied statecraft alongside captive Moorish generals and Jewish cartographers. The most systematic was Matthias Corvinus's Bibliotheca Corviniana, a royal library containing not just books but annotated case studies of every major decision from his reign, complete with alternative scenario analyses. Religious preparations for death became political theater of the highest order. Dying kings carefully staged their final sacraments. Charles V's last communion lasted 6 hours as he methodically transferred authority to his son between prayers. Some, like Louis IX, went further by having their deathbed agonies meticulously recorded as saintly exemplars. The shrewdest turned their funerals into constitutional conventions. Casimir IV's corpse was paraded through every major Polish city, so local assemblies could swear allegiance to his heir at each stop. The ultimate test of these systems came during regencies. When Charles VI of France descended into madness, his wife Isabeau didn't just rule. She convened weekly governance hackathons, where rival factions competed to solve administrative challenges. In Castile, Ferdinand's death left Joanna, the mad, nominally queen, but the real power flowed through counselors trained in his decision tree protocols for handling routine matters without royal input. These weren't failures of monarchy, but stress tests proving resilient systems could outlast their creators' competence. The most successful legacies embraced radical transparency. Instead of hiding state secrets, rulers like Eric of Pomerania published red books containing complete financial records and policy rationales for public scrutiny, medieval open governance experiments. Others institutionalized self-criticism. The annual Chapter of Faults in Burgundy required ministers to publicly confess mistakes before proposing corrective systems. This created cultures where institutional memory outlasted individuals. When the brilliant Chancellor Thomas More fell from grace, Henry VIII's systems continued functioning because he'd replicated his expertise across dozens of trained deputies. In the end, the greatest kings became architects of their own obsolescence. They built systems so robust their personal presence became optional, the ultimate paradox of power. When visitors walk through Westminster Hall today, built by William Rufus in 1097, they're standing in a space designed to outlast its creator's wildest dreams. The true medieval legacy isn't in crumbling castles or yellowed charters, but in the enduring idea that governance can be systematized, that institutions can transcend individuals. A revelation as revolutionary now as it was when scribes first pressed royal seals into warm wax. The medieval king's relationship with time itself was a fascinating paradox. They ruled in an era when most peasants couldn't conceptualize the hour, yet their administrations developed temporal precision that would shame modern corporations. Royal chancelleries didn't just date documents. They timestamped them to the hour using candle measurements. Third candle of morning watch, creating audit trails for accountability. When Richard I scheduled military operations during the Third Crusade, his orders specified phases of the moon for night attacks, lunar calendars being more reliable than primitive clocks. This wasn't primitive guesswork, but sophisticated chronometry adapted to technological constraints. Agricultural management followed equally precise cycles. Royal stewards maintained perpetual crop calendars, dictating when each estate should sow, rotate, and harvest based on soil conditions, some so accurate they predicted yields within 5% variance. The Doomsday Book didn't just catalog landholdings, but included optimal planting schedules for different terrains. Kings like Henry III took personal interest in these rhythms, ordering fruit trees planted at precise intervals to maximize orchard productivity decades later, a striking example of intergenerational planning. Financial years were carefully engineered for control. Instead of arbitrary calendar cycles, medieval treasurers closed books after harvests when tax revenues peaked. Edward I synchronized fiscal years with military campaigning seasons, budgets finalized when troops disbanded for winter. The smartest rulers like Philip IV manipulated time itself for profit. His annual tax collections sometimes occurred twice yearly by redefining the accounting period, a medieval version of creative accounting that funded his wars without immediate unrest. Legal systems developed temporal sophistication that still influences modern law. Statutes of limitations appeared as early as 1236 in England, with Henry III provisions of Merton establishing strict deadlines for inheritance claims. Court sessions followed law terms, timed to agricultural slack periods so peasants could attend. Even trial procedures incorporated psychological timing. Defendants were allowed exactly 3 sunrise to sunset days to produce witnesses before judgment defaulted, creating urgency without appearing unfair. Military operations depended on temporal coordination that seems impossible without modern tech. When coordinating the Siege of Acre in 1191, Richard I and Philip Augustus synchronized attacks using beacon chains spanning 200 miles, prearranged flame sequences conveying complex messages like attack at next high tide. Naval invasions were timed to lunar cycles for optimal tides, while cavalry commanders used sundial compasses to coordinate flanking maneuvers. The Mongol threat forced European kings to develop even faster systems. Courier networks that could relay messages from Vienna to London in under 9 days by rotating fresh horses every 15 miles. Ecclesiastical timekeeping became a political weapon. Kings fought bitter battles over control of church bells, their peals structuring daily life across kingdoms. When Philip IV wanted to assert dominance over French clergy, he didn't just tax them, but mandated royal approval for all bell tower clock installations. The 14th century clock wars saw monarchs like Charles V commissioning extravagant public clocks that displayed astrological signs alongside hours, subtly suggesting royal control over cosmic order itself. Personal time management separated great kings from the merely competent. Frederick II maintained 4 parallel daily schedules: administrative, fixed appointment slots for petitioners; strategic, long-term planning sessions; intellectual, debates with scholars; and contemplative, solitary walks for unstructured thinking. His secretariat color-coded documents using different inks: red for immediate action, blue for strategic issues, black for archival, an early version of priority tagging. English kings developed similar systems, with Edward I rolls of urgency classifying matters by response windows from before sunset to next parliament. The most fascinating temporal manipulation occurred in succession planning. Wise kings like Louis IX staged gradual power transfers, first sharing seals, then presiding jointly over courts, finally having heirs issue solo decrees months before death. This avoided disruptive transitions while allowing real-time mentoring. Others used time capsules, burying sealed instructions for successors to open at predetermined crises. When Henry V knew he was dying during the French campaign, he didn't just appoint a regent, but created a timed release of authority, different advisors gaining specific powers at set intervals after his death. Calendar reforms reveal medieval kings' obsession with temporal control. When the Julian calendar drifted out of sync with seasons, monarchs like Roger II of Sicily commissioned astronomical tables correcting the discrepancy centuries before Gregory XIII reform. Alfonso X's Alphonsine tables remain navigation standards for 300 years, their lunar motion calculations accurate to within hours over decades. These weren't academic exercises, but practical tools for tax collection, agriculture, and military planning. Whoever controlled time controlled the kingdom's rhythm. Modern executives could learn from medieval time discipline. The 1370 Statute of Laborers didn't just fix wages, but defined the medieval workday as from sunrise to sunset, with due time for meals and prayer. Recognizing productivity requires structured rest. Royal administrators tracked officials' response times, with tardy replies earning progressively sterner wax seal colors on follow-up scrolls. When Edward III wanted to accelerate legal reforms, he didn't just demand results, but instituted weekly progress reviews in person, the 14th century equivalent of agile sprints. The ultimate temporal legacy was dynastic time, the shift from measuring reigns by years lived to systems sustained. When visitors view the 1400 Westminster clock, the oldest surviving mechanical clock in England, they're seeing more than medieval engineering. They're witnessing the moment kings realized controlling time's measurement was more powerful than controlling territory. The greatest rulers didn't just build for their lifetimes, but created systems operating on century scales, true masters of time in an age when most couldn't read an hourglass. The medieval king's relationship with space and territory was a masterclass in practical geometry. They governed realms without accurate maps, yet developed spatial management systems that would impress modern logisticians. When William the Conqueror commissioned the Doomsday Book, he wasn't just taking inventory, but creating a revolutionary data visualization of his kingdom, organizing 13,418 settlements into circuits that royal inspectors could methodically traverse like human GIS systems. Each entry contained precise travel times between locations, 2 days' ride in good weather, creating an implicit road network that functioned without a single drawn map. Castle placement followed geometric principles worthy of military academies. Edward I's Welsh castle ring wasn't random, but a calculated defense-in-depth system, each fortress visible to at least two others for beacon communication, with overlapping artillery ranges covering all approach routes. The smartest kings employed what we'd now call Voronoi diagrams, dividing territories into cells where each castle was the optimal relief point for surrounding villages. Richard the Lionheart took this further in Normandy, spacing fortifications exactly 1 day's forced march apart so reinforcements could cycle between them indefinitely. Agricultural land management revealed similar sophistication. Royal foresters didn't just patrol woods, but maintained detailed yield maps, tracking soil productivity across different sectors, adjusting crop rotations accordingly. The famous English open field system was meticulously geometric, strips plowed in standardized widths to facilitate fair redistribution, with paths calculated for optimal ox-team turnaround. When kings like Henry III established new towns, they used rope-in-peg surveying to create perfectly grid streets, not for aesthetics, but to maximize marketplace visibility from guard towers. Trade route optimization was another spatial puzzle. Royal staple ports were strategically located where coastal and riverine routes intersected, creating natural distribution hubs. The Hansa Merchants Network followed gravity model principles centuries before the term existed, shipping volumes between cities accurately predicted by their populations and inverse distance. Kings employed traveling salesmen, algorithms avant la lettre. Royal purveyors followed circuitous but mathematically optimized routes to collect taxes from scattered estates with minimal backtracking. Military campaigns demonstrated frighteningly precise spatial awareness. During the 1415 Agincourt campaign, Henry V's scouts provided daily updates on water table depths, knowing exactly where heavy armor would bog down in mud. Crusader kings like Louis IX maintained detailed shadow maps of desert wells, allowing armies to traverse arid regions by leapfrogging between known water sources. The Mongols' approach forced European kings to develop even more advanced systems. Frederick II created Europe's first true topographic maps showing elevation gradients after encountering the invaders' terrain-based tactics. Religious space was equally politicized. Kings manipulated pilgrimage routes to pass through strategically important regions, stimulating local economies while maintaining surveillance over remote areas. When constructing cathedrals, they ensured bell towers doubled as watchtowers overlooking approach roads. The shrewdest, like Philip Augustus, deliberately sited new monasteries near unstable borders, their scriptoriums producing maps under the guise of religious work while actually charting military geography. Urban planning became spatial psychology. Medieval kings designed capital cities as legibility engines. Straight boulevards radiating from palaces weren't just processional routes, but lines of sight for crowd control. Curved streets in merchant quarters slowed cavalry charges during revolts, while concentric city walls created kill zones that mathematicians would later recognize as fractal defense patterns. When Charles V rebuilt Paris after the English occupation, he mandated that all new streets be wide enough for cannon transport. Urban planning as artillery logistics. The most fascinating spatial systems govern information flow. Royal messenger routes followed small world network principles. Most local messages traveled short hops between villages, but strategically placed royal posting stations enabled long-distance leaps when needed. Archive organization was equally sophisticated. Edward I's lawyers developed a memory palace filing system where document locations corresponded to legal categories, allowing retrieval without indexes. Navigation technology received royal boosts. Kings like Henry the Navigator didn't just fund exploration, but systematized it. His Sagres Academy developed standardized nautical charts with rum lines for constant bearing sailing. Portolan maps used color-coded wind roses that functioned as primitive polar coordinate systems. When Columbus sought backing, it wasn't his wild claims that convinced Ferdinand and Isabella, but his mastery of these royal cartographic standards. Modern military theorists still study medieval kings' spatial innovations. The defensible perimeter concept used in modern base construction originated with Richard I's desert forts in Palestine. Grid-based urban planning owes debts to French bastions designed under Philip II. Even GPS routing algorithms echo the itinerant kingship model, medieval monarchs constantly moving through their realms in optimized circuits that balanced visibility, security, and resource access. The ultimate spatial legacy was conceptual, the shift from viewing territory as land to be held to space to be managed. When modern logistics experts use GIS systems to plan delivery routes, they're employing principles medieval kings applied using parchment and memory. The greatest rulers didn't just conquer space, but systematized its use, true masters of geometry in an age when most couldn't calculate area. Their real triumph was making spatial order from chaos without a single accurate map. The medieval king's mastery of information warfare would put modern cyber units to shame. They manipulated perceptions without digital tools, crafting narratives that shaped realities across continents. When William the Conqueror invaded England, he didn't just bring soldiers, but an entire propaganda apparatus. Scribes prepared 3 versions of his claim to the throne, varying in detail for different audiences, while minstrels circulated songs portraying Harold as an oath-breaker months before the first sword was drawn. This wasn't crude manipulation, but sophisticated message tailoring. Ecclesiastical Latin versions for papal courts, simplified rhymes for peasant consumption, visual narratives on tapestries for the illiterate majority. Royal archives became information fortresses worthy of NSA scrutiny. Richard the Lionheart's Chancery developed an early version of document classification, standard parchments for routine matters, special watermark sheets for sensitive correspondence, and ultra-secure silent letters, where critical passages were written in lemon juice between visible lines, revealed only when heated over candles. The most sensitive records employed steganography, centuries before the term existed. Frederick II hid military plans in musical notation, with troop movements encoded as melodic intervals that court musicians could decipher during performances. Disinformation campaigns reached artistic heights. When Edward III wanted to conceal his preparations for the Battle of Crécy, he didn't just impose secrecy, but launched a counter-narrative, having agents spread rumors about his army's weakness while actually building strength. The French intercepted these leaked messages and fatally underestimated English forces. Similarly, when Saladin sought to demoralize Crusader garrisons, he didn't just threaten. He had scribes forge letters from Christian leaders announcing fictitious defeats, carefully replicating wax seals and handwriting quirks that medieval forensic experts now recognize as early psychological operations. Public relations were systematized with frightening modernity. Royal progresses weren't just travel, but mobile media events. Kings like Henry II deliberately staged spontaneous encounters where they dispensed justice under oak trees, knowing the image would spawn legends of accessible monarchy. Coronation ceremonies included precisely timed moments for crowd interaction. When Richard II threw coins to Londoners during his procession, the locations were pre-selected near important merchant guild halls to reinforce commercial loyalty. The control of historical narratives was equally calculated. Royal chroniclers didn't just record events, but crafted them. Henry V's scribes prepared 3 versions of the Agincourt campaign: a sanitized account for domestic consumption, a detailed tactical report for military archives, and an exaggerated epic for continental dissemination. Monasteries received approved timelines of events. When King John wanted to erase his nephew Arthur's murder from history, he didn't just kill the boy, but pressured chroniclers to record the death as accidental drowning, complete with fabricated eyewitness accounts. Language itself became a weapon of precision. Royal proclamations employed carefully graded terminology. A request versus command carried nuanced differences in expected compliance levels. Legal documents used nested conditional clauses that would impress modern programmers. Edward I's Statutes of Wales contained provisions like, if the aforesaid burgess shall have paid, but the payment was delayed by tempest or other act of God, then, demonstrating astonishing foresight about edge cases. Counterintelligence operations were ruthlessly efficient. Edward IV established Europe's first dedicated black chamber, a team of clerks who steamed open and copied all foreign ambassadors' correspondence before resealing them with forged wax insignias. Their greatest coup came when they intercepted Louis XI's letters revealing planned attacks on English wool shipments, allowing Edward to preemptively embargo French ports while feigning ignorance. The most sophisticated kings weaponized cultural symbols. When Henry VII emerged victorious from the Wars of Roses, he didn't just execute rivals, but systematically co-opted their emblems. The White Rose of York was incorporated into Tudor heraldry, their family saints added to royal chapels, even their favorite dishes served at court banquets. This wasn't mere appropriation, but psychological erasure. By claiming his enemies' cultural DNA, Henry made rebellion seem like self-betrayal to their former supporters. Information dissemination followed proto-scientific principles. Royal decrees were strategically placed in locations matching human traffic patterns, posted not just on church doors, but near mills, wells, and marketplace privies where people congregated. Messengers were trained in memory techniques to orally supplement written proclamations with standardized talking points, a medieval version of key messages training for spokespeople. The ultimate test of these systems came during crises. When the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 threatened to overthrow Richard II, his advisors didn't just mobilize troops, but launched a coordinated information blitz, dispatching trusted knights to read carefully worded promises in every village while simultaneously having bishops denounce the rebels from pulpits. Within days, the revolt fragmented as participants couldn't agree on which facts to believe about royal concessions already granted. Modern information specialists still study medieval techniques. The CIA's Mighty Wurlitzer propaganda playbook during the Cold War borrowed directly from Tudor rumor mills. Corporate crisis management teams unconsciously echo Edward I's strategy of flooding zones with controlled narratives. Even social media algorithms that personalize content delivery are digital descendants of those medieval scribes who carefully tailored messages for different audiences. The greatest kings didn't just wield information. They systematized its manipulation at scale, proving perception management isn't a modern invention, but a rediscovered medieval art. The medieval king's approach to crisis management would make modern disaster response teams blush. They routinely faced existential threats without satellites, antibiotics, or even reliable weather forecasts, yet developed contingency systems that remained shockingly relevant. When the Black Death wiped out a third of Europe's population in 1348, Edward III didn't just pray. He implemented what we'd now call all-hazards planning, establishing emergency food reserves at strategic monasteries, mandating corpse disposal protocols to prevent groundwater contamination, even creating primitive contact tracing by requiring innkeepers to record travelers' routes. His administration's Ordinance of Labors wasn't just wage control, but a comprehensive economic stabilization package, freezing prices on essentials while subsidizing skilled craftsmen's training to rebuild decimated industries. Financial crises elicited equally sophisticated responses. When repeated coin debasements under Henry VIII triggered runaway inflation, his ministers didn't just reissue currency, but executed a full monetary reset, a medieval version of quantitative tightening where old coins were recalled, melted, and reminted at precise silver content ratios. They even established temporary exchange bureaus, where peasants could trade debased pennies for new currency at graduated rates based on distance from London, recognizing velocity of money differences between urban and rural economies. Military emergencies revealed astonishing logistical creativity. During the Siege of Calais in 1347, Edward III faced imminent starvation of his troops, until his quartermasters implemented a vertical supply chain, converting fishing boats into floating warehouses anchored just beyond French artillery range. with daily distributions timed to tidal flows. Centuries before modern militaries formalized the concept, medieval kings practiced adaptive logistics. Richard the Lionheart's Crusader army in Palestine maintained mobile leather workshops that could reshoe 2,000 horses overnight using pre-cut hides and standardized measurements. Succession crises produced constitutional innovations we still use. When Henry V died suddenly in 1422, leaving an infant heir, his council didn't just appoint regents, but created a governance circuit breaker, a rotating triumvirate where power shifted monthly between military, clerical, and administrative leaders to prevent any single faction from dominating. The system included built-in dead man switches. If any regent died unexpectedly, his authority automatically redistributed to the remaining two rather than passing to subordinates. Agricultural disasters prompted systematic overhauls. After the Great Famine of 1315-17, Edward II ministers developed Europe's first resilience metrics, calculating each shire's minimum required grain reserves based on population and soil quality, then mandating storage in distributed underground silos to prevent total collapse. They even created primitive futures markets, allowing villages to pre-purchase harvests from more fertile regions, effectively inventing medieval crop insurance. Rebellions were met with psychological operations that anticipated modern counterinsurgency. During the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, Richard II's commanders didn't just crush the uprising, but executed a precision, hearts and minds campaign, publicly trying and executing only the most visible leaders while quietly compensating victims of rebel violence, then launching a propaganda tour where the king personally heard grievances in affected villages, but always with his armored retainers conspicuously positioned just out of sight. Public health emergencies saw responses that predated epidemiology. When leprosy outbreaks threatened major cities, kings like Louis VIII didn't just banish sufferers, but established specialized lazar houses with quarantine protocols. Patients entered through winding maze-like corridors that prevented airborne transmission, while caregivers lived in rotating shifts to limit exposure. Frederick II went further, mandating regular medical checkups for royal troops and keeping detailed morbidity records that revealed malaria was mosquito-borne centuries before modern science confirmed it. Infrastructure failures prompted engineering breakthroughs. After the 1286 collapse of the bridge at Berwick disrupted Scottish border defenses, Edward I didn't just rebuild. He instituted Europe's first standardized bridge inspection regime. Teams of warden engineers evaluated all major crossings annually using measurement rods to track foundation shifts, with reports filed in triplicate to royal archives. His engineers developed load-bearing formulas that remained construction standards until the Industrial Revolution. The most impressive crisis systems addressed multiple threats simultaneously. During the 1264 Barons' War, Henry III's administration managed to suppress rebellions in 7 counties without diverting troops from Welsh border defenses, maintain food supplies to London despite rebel blockades by reopening forgotten Roman aqueducts, and keep royal mints operating by having gold shipments disguised as pilgrim groups. This multi-threaded crisis response was all coordinated using a color-coded parchment tracking system that functioned without a single centralized command post. Modern emergency managers still study medieval precedents. FEMA's distributed stockpile strategy echoes Edward III plague reserves. The Federal Reserve's monetary tools descend from Tudor currency stabilization. Even cybersecurity, kill chain, protocols mirror Richard II's layered rebellion response. The greatest medieval kings didn't just survive crises. They engineered systems that turned disasters into opportunities for institutional strengthening. Their real genius was recognizing that resilience isn't about preventing chaos, but building structures that thrive within it. The twilight of medieval kingship reveals its most enduring paradox. The very institutions designed to perpetuate royal authority ultimately birthed the modern world that would render it obsolete. Take the English Parliament, originally convened by Edward I as a rubber-stamp tax approval body. Its procedural innovations, committees for specialized legislation, recorded votes to pressure dissenters, public readings of proposed statutes, unwittingly created a replicable model for representative government. The Model Parliament of 1295, intended as a crown control mechanism, contained the DNA of constitutional monarchy that would later constrain royal power itself. Royal bureaucracies followed similar ironic trajectories. What began as personal extensions of the king's will, the exchequer for finances, chancery for documents, king's bench for justice, evolved into autonomous institutions with their own traditions and standards. By Henry VII's reign, these bodies could operate for months without direct royal input, their professionalized staffs maintaining continuity through regime changes. The systems kings built to project power across time and space ultimately developed institutional identities separate from the crown that created them, like Frankenstein's monster gaining independent consciousness. Military innovations meant to preserve feudal order instead undermined it. Edward III's creation of standing contract armies, to avoid relying on unreliable feudal levies, gave rise to professional officer corps whose loyalties shifted from persons to principles. The Longbow Corps that won at Crécy and Agincourt weren't noble knights, but yeoman archers whose battlefield effectiveness shattered the myth of aristocratic military supremacy. Artillery units developed to reduce castles made noble fortifications obsolete, transferring defensive advantages to centralized state armies. Financial systems designed to fund royal ambitions accidentally created alternative power centers. The Medici and Fugger banking families gained influence by bankrolling monarchs, then used that leverage to demand policy concessions. When Charles V needed loans to fight the Reformation, his bankers required him to establish predictable repayment schedules, effectively inventing modern sovereign debt markets that would later constrain imperial ambitions. Even something as mundane as standardized coinage, intended to facilitate royal tax collection, gave rise to merchant classes whose economic independence fostered political assertiveness. Legal reforms meant to strengthen royal justice planted seeds of judicial independence. Henry II's creation of traveling royal judges, to override corrupt local courts, established the principle of professional jurisprudence separate from executive whim. Magna Carta's famous clause about selling justice, to no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice, began as baronial self-interest but became a rallying cry for rule of law over personal rule. By Richard II's reign, judges were citing precedents from decades past against current royal wishes, the embryonic concept of stare decisis that would underpin modern legal systems. Information control systems bred their own antidotes. Royal efforts to standardize weights and measures created shared frameworks for commercial record-keeping that enabled long-distance trade beyond royal oversight. The very parchment rolls kings used to track subjects could be repurposed. Merchants adapted exchequer accounting methods to monitor shipments. Towns copied royal charter formats to secure their own privileges. When Louis IX commissioned encyclopedias to consolidate knowledge under royal patronage, he inadvertently facilitated scholarship that would later question divine right itself. Even personal monarchies' most iconic features transformed into constraints. The royal touch that supposedly cured scrofula, a ceremony requiring elaborate preparation, became a burden. Elizabeth I performed it reluctantly. James I openly doubted it. And by Charles II's restoration, it was more public relations than sacred rite. Coronation oaths intended to demonstrate divine favor became checklists for constitutional compliance. The king's peace, that once meant personal royal protection, evolved into the abstract concept of public order maintained by professional police. The ultimate irony emerged in governance philosophy. Machiavelli's The Prince, written to advise rulers on maintaining power, became studied more by their opponents than successors. Jean Bodin's theories of indivisible sovereignty, developed to justify royal authority, were later used to argue for popular will as the true sovereign. The king's two bodies doctrine, distinguishing mortal person from eternal institution, That once elevated monarchy now reminds us all institutions outlive their creators. Yet medieval kingship's true legacy isn't in what it became, but what it overcame. These rulers built systems that tamed feudal chaos, bridged the ancient and modern worlds, and demonstrated that human institutions can evolve beyond their founders' intentions. When modern bureaucrats file triplicate forms or legislators debate in specialized committees, they're unwittingly channeling Edward the First administrative genius. The greatest kings didn't just rule their time. They built frameworks so robust they could eventually operate without kings at all.